All right. Welcome back. Part two. And yeah, I just want to say if you're out there, if you've been working out for more than 5 years and you're struggling to get results and you're seeing some plateaus, I promise you, you're probably working out incorrectly. You're probably not training your workspace and you're not training your connective tissue. And with that, kind of want to clarify some things from last episode and also kind of give some kind of like take home advice. And kind of want to start with this concept of a rep is not a rep. And Josh, you want to take us from
Sure.
here?
So, whenever we think of a rep scheme, it's really a construct of time, and it allows us to kind of not have to think about it. So, if we take 8 to 12 reps, that's really giving us a time frame. And so by just making it easy as far as 8 to 12 reps, that allows us to not have to worry about the more detailed parameters. But if someone is thinking of what's the goal? The goal, there has to be a goal to the rep scheme, right? Um, so if we're talking about hypertrophy, that's going to be a different time frame than if it's fast twitch muscle fiber um, versus slow twitch versus endurance. So there's a lot of factors that come into what a rep actually is. Um, but we've tried to simplify it just to kind of create this easy to understand parameter.
Yeah, because our muscles, they don't know what a rep is. They know uh, intensity and they know time under tension.
Right.
And with that, we kind of came up with this concept of, well, if we're maybe, let's say we're going for hypertrophy, for instance, and we're looking for increased muscle size of fast twitch fibers, we know our intensity needs to be, we need to take it to failure, but we also need to fail within 24 to 40 seconds, maybe definitely for sure under 60 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
You take that, reps like 2 to 3 seconds, you divide that by 40 seconds, you're kind of getting somewhere between like that 8 and 12 rep range, which we always thought about for hypertrophy,
Right.
instead of kind of looking at time under tension.
Yeah. So I think that if we ask people like, why are you doing 8 to 12 reps? They're not going to really have an answer, right? Or some would, some wouldn't. Um, and so some people, they just see the prescription written out on the board, like, oh, today the exercise is blah 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 blah, and they just like, oh, they're just doing the rep just to complete the rep. They're not thinking about why am I picking this parameter, because if we think about, every tissue has a different force profile.
Yes.
Connective tissue has its own force profile, and we can even subdivide that into, are we talking tendon, which is going to be a little bit more springy? We have ligament, which is going to be a little bit more, robust as far as like needing stiffness. Then we have muscle, and obviously we can subdivide the muscle into different types. And obviously joint. So like we have all these different, you know, things that we can train, but they all actually need a different force profile, which then comes into like the reps. The reps, we can define a particular force profile into a particular rep scheme. But if you're just thinking 8 to 12 reps because that's what the board says today, it might not be as specific, which is kind of what we were talking about last time. We just need to be more dialed into the parameters that we're trying to accomplish based on our goals.
Yeah. So we've talked on this concept of reps not a rep, also kind of how uh, talking about like how time under tension is maybe a little more accurate way of describing kind of how to set the parameters for whatever the goal is we're trying to accomplish. But also, I think the other biggest mistake that people are kind of running into is just focusing actually on the rep and not on the way the rep feels.
Yeah. So there's a whole concept that we can get into, that we will get into, but the feel is so important into how the like what tissue are we trying to train?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So yeah. Going based off of feel. So if we're rather versus then going after trying to complete the exercise. So We'll just take like the bench press for instance, and yeah, instead of like a lot of times people were like, oh, I want to make my chest bigger, so I'm going to do the bench press.
Mhm.
Pretty darn good exercise for making the chest
Right.
if done correctly. So people think just by doing bench press, doing the motion of up and down, is going to make my chest bigger. But if you're just focusing on completing the rep, the real goal is like we're trying to hit failure in the pec to make the pec. So by changing the way you see things and focusing more on the way it feels by now when I'm in the bench press, I'm focusing on contracting and using my chest as hard as I can rather than trying to lock and reach like a lockout at the top. You're going to see some better results with that.
Yeah, definitely. So by putting that focus a little bit more internal into the actual tissue versus just the external display of the lift, I think that and like bodybuilders, if you ask a bodybuilder, like they might be thinking of some of those things, but whenever we move into more of a like a functional type training, we try to almost move away from that. But if our goal is to develop a particular tissue, um, I think that actually focusing on the tissue is important.
And the way it feels when training. And not to say that there's never a time for focusing on the rep. Like if we're in competition, for sure, it doesn't really. You don't really care if you've felt your pec working or not, in like a power lift of the bench press. But if the goal is in the competition to complete the rep, I mean, who cares how it really feels? Your object is just to complete the lift. So those are the times where it'd be. I mean, it's obviously more important to then focus on the rep rather than the way it feels.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but like when our normal everyday training, trying to maybe get away from the completion of the rep. Not saying you can't do that, but then within the rep scheme or the time domain that you're trying to, whatever goal it is you're going after, trying to then just kind of take mental notes of, am I using the right muscles to ultimately increase the goal that I have?
Yeah, because I think again it gets back to I completed the exercise. So the assumption is I completed the exercise. The byproduct is going to be the training of the correct tissue. But it might not be that easy. It might actually be that we need to focus a little bit more on what the body feels when completing the exercise. And we might not even need to complete the exercise. We might need to break the exercise down into, smaller parts and focus on the sticking points or the areas where we might be struggling, versus just worrying about getting the lift done, at the time.
Yeah. Um, okay, so kind of clarifying what I said earlier about if you've been working out for a while and you're struggling to get the results and you're seeing a lot of plateauing. I said you're probably working out incorrectly. And kind of to elaborate more on that a little bit further, I wanted to kind of talk about yeah, and you kind of just mentioned one of them, like sticking points. So when focusing on the rep, and let's just go back to the bench press for instance. A lot of times, like I said, we're not focusing on feel. So sometimes by just slowing the rep down, like especially eccentrically, and feeling that tension all the way down, we can ensure that we're putting tension in the muscle fiber the full length. And a lot of times when we're kind of going back to that old model of like, just kind of trying to complete the bench press rep, we end up kind of skipping through sections of the pec length, and we kind of bypass that. So we don't actually kind of really work the muscle out in its entirety. And what we end up doing is especially it's usually probably most common in like you'll see at least in the bench press, like that bottom third of the rep. We kind of see this kind of like dropping real quickly, bouncing off the chest, and then coming back up. And usually, like a lot of times when we see that that dropping and kind of like that last third, that kind of speed up, a lot of times it's actually that we may actually end up having connective tissue dysfunction,
Mm-hmm.
and that we don't actually have good, strong enough, adequate connective tissue to support the load all the way down into that full range of motion.
Yeah, so in addition to connective tissue, which we'll definitely touch on, also as we get longer, the ability to create force tends to drop off a little bit, right?
Yeah, so I think we showed this last time. We have kind of like this, for those who are listening, this line graph here. We've got force on the vertical axis, and we've got the length of a muscle on the horizontal axis, and we kind of have this natural bell curve. Uh, in basically the brain muscle connection. So typically at the end ranges, when a muscle is shortest and when a muscle is longest, we have the least amount of force production into that, because we also have like the least amount of brain neurological input going into those lengths.
Mm-hmm.
So as we get to that end range of the bench press, we have a little bit less brain muscle connection. So we could also see that we just don't have as much force production output. So we also end up kind of bouncing out of it to kind of skip that end range and then come back up, and just really kind of utilizing that stretch reflex. But end up in doing so, what we also do is then we end up skipping out on training the connective tissue in that zone, and then we can also then therefore run into more issues down the road.
Yeah, we can see potential risk of injury, because we're using the connective tissue almost as a shock absorber. And then if we're talking shoulder, the labral tissue, as it kind of reaches that abutment, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of using the muscle contraction all the way through, if we lost our ability to create a contraction, then it rests on the joint itself and then the surrounding, structures. So over time, that can create some almost micro trauma. Not necessarily going to be painful, not necessarily going to be a problem in and of itself, but it does create some maybe abnormal fibrosis or remodeling of that surrounding structure, which might also limit our range of motion. Because we've talked about before where after you do a 6 to 8 week wave of a bench press, like our body's naturally going to get better at doing the movement, right?
Yes.
So we're going to compress the nervous system to be able to drive as much force as possible into that particular movement. And by doing that, we actually make our range of motion a little bit less to try to get as much force production out of that particular line of tension that we're utilizing in the actual bench press itself.
So can we see if I can rephrase this? So we'll take the bench press run. So whenever we're going through a particular range of motion, like a patternized exercise like the bench press,
right,
we're not using the full range of motion of that joint space. We're using actually just kind of like a tiny little section of that.
Right.
And by doing that repetitively and over several weeks, maybe months, our body's just naturally going to get better at the bench press. And the way it does that is by adapting, because keeping a good joint workspace costs a lot of energy.
Yes.
So if we're not using it, we're going to lose it.
Yep.
So what will end up happening is the joint itself will actually kind of shrink up and accommodate just to the tiny little fraction that it's using in the bench press.
Correct. Yeah. So in the beginning, that quote unquote contraction is really more neurologic. The brain says, this is what you've been doing a lot of. We're going to limit you to that. And then over time, there will be some actual changes to the actual capsular tissue if that's what you keep doing. But originally, or in the very beginning, it's more neurologic. So if we, after that 6 to 8 week wave of bench press, if we stopped bench pressing and maybe did some other things, um, we could regain that range of motion. Maybe not 100% right away, but we would be able to gain it back over time. But if we, over years and years and years, continue to do the exact same thing in the exact same way, that nervous system, compressing continuously will actually make biological changes to that capsular space.
Yes. And I don't want to get too far. We'll talk about workspace in a second, but kind of back to this connective tissue. So to kind of explain the connective tissue and how important it is, the analogy I kind of like to use is imagine you had like 10 pounds of mass inside of a balloon, and you go to throw that balloon down on the ground. It's just going to burst because it's got a weak surrounding encapsulating that mass. Whereas if you were to take that same 10 pounds of mass and you put it into like something like a slam ball, when you go to throw it on the ground, it's actually going to be able to absorb all that force, and it's not going to like bleed out that energy. So connective tissues literally kind of like encapsulates all of our muscles. It's not only our tendons with which attaches the muscle to the bone, but also like encapsulates that, and it just allows for more stiffness and allows that muscle to pull against and actually utilize all of its force.
Yeah, so it helps to transfer force. So like one muscle contracts and then it transfers through the connective tissue to the next joint or the next part of the movement to allow the flow of energy to move the barbell or whatever.
Yeah, so if we don't have good quality connective tissue, we're essentially kind of limiting ourselves and causing maybe some plateaus in our progress.
Yeah, so if we're constantly building muscle tissue, because like when's the last time you've trained specifically for connective tissue?
Probably, I would argue most people don't even know what we're talking about.
Correct. So if you're scratching your head and you're wondering like, what are they talking about? Well, you're the prime candidate of why we're even addressing this. The connective tissue can be trained separately from the muscle. So you want to talk a little bit about like the difference between like a moving contraction versus like a not moving, basically?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a little bit self-explanatory. I think it's going to make sense early. So if we're trying to, make our muscles, our red tissue, as we like to call it, bigger, stronger, faster, it likes movements. Muscles like movements. It contracts and relaxes, contracts and relaxes. And by training the actual movement, constant movement, we're going to be training the red stuff. Connective tissue, on the other hand, doesn't like movement. So the way we train connective tissue is at length. So basically taking your joint or your muscle, if you want to call it, whatever it is we're trying to work on, trying to better improve, trying to add more strength to, trying to add more size to. If we take that muscle to length, we'll just take back to bench press and we kind of go down and we hold isometrically. So we actually don't actually create movement. We're just fighting gravity by holding and doing that isometric contraction. Since we're not moving, the signal from the tissue that gets sent to the brain is, instead of saying, hey, let's maybe make our muscles stronger, or let's make our muscles bigger, it's saying, hey, we need more stiffness and we need to have more connective tissue to lay down.
Yeah, so whenever you're in that lengthened position, the muscle is trying to contract, it is contracting, but because there's no movement happening, the force is going somewhere, right? So
yes.
it spills over to the connective tissue, which then that's where we get the signal for the connective tissue to potentially adapt, to create more stiffness. Because think of it again as like it helps to catch the muscle contraction. So, a trampoline, like if we were bouncing on a really kind of floppy trampoline, we wouldn't really be able to go higher. But if we actually create tighter springs, we actually can create a little bit of a higher bounce. But we have to kind of, we don't want so stiff tissue that we can't move, but we don't want so pliable tissue that it doesn't have the ability to stiffen either. So, every exercise, every movement, again, has a force profile, but also has a particular stiffness profile that allows us to get the most range of motion, most force production, where it combines all to give us the most efficient, movement possible.
And yeah, and there's more ways to train connective tissue. Probably the ones you probably are probably most talked about are the like plyometric training, and then also then maybe slightly less talked about is just more eccentric loading. So other ways you can train connective tissue is not just at length, but going to length. So just focusing on that eccentric movement. So if we're in the bench press and we want to improve the connective tissue of our chest, we're not thinking about just lowering the barbell and completing the rep. We're thinking about lowering the barbell, keeping tension in the chest, so switching to that mindset of how it feels,
Right.
and then also going slow, especially in that maybe that last third where we have been like previously bounced out of it. But by going slow and focusing on maybe on that 1/3, we can then also then now train that connective tissue where previously we've been skipping. And you kind of saw this in history before, how like the Soviets would train sticking points
Right.
in their
Right.
movements. So parts where they'd struggle, completing, just by doing long like isometric holds, you can then tell your body then, hey, we need more connective tissue in that specific length, and therefore kind of help with force production in those sticking points.
Yeah, just to reiterate, how many people, maybe in the first set, but typically not as we progress, think about the lowering instead of just letting gravity drop it, right?
Yeah.
Same thing in like a squat. How many people are thinking contracting to pull yourself down into a squat versus just letting the bar kind of drag you down? We tend to think more about the concentric, like creating the force versus absorbing the force. And the ability to absorb force is really what we're getting at with the connective tissue. The ability for us to absorb more force allows us then to be able to actually create more force in that concentric portion of the exercise.
Yes. And then then we kind of talked about how before, like how a lot of times we'll kind of skip that bottom third and end up kind of just kind of speeding through and then kind of allowing either the stopping of kind of that in range of motion and just kind of stopping on our very in range, and then kind of using that stretch reflex to kind of bounce us out of that zone. We may have that bottom third, we may have weaker connective tissue, and then using that to kind of complete the exercise. But in doing so, the other issues that you kind of may run into is like, and you can speak, maybe Josh speak more into this, when you're constantly maybe you can explain, yeah, what happens when you, if you're not controlling that tempo, you're not owning the tension that all the way down, and you're relying on your joint to stop you. I mean, that doesn't sound like a good thing, right?
No, not typically. Again, if you're in competition and you got to complete the rep, you do what you got to do. But in training, we want to be training in the safest way possible. So we don't want to accumulate more trauma than what we actually need for the adaptation, right? So think of as we kind of bounce at the end range, there's again that micro trauma. The micro trauma can lead to some inflammation. That inflammation can lead to some fibrosis and or scarring. That then leads to loss of workspace. And workspace, again, just for, it's the amount of space that the joint has to work in. So more is not necessarily better, but every exercise, every movement has a prerequisite of the amount of workspace that the joint needs to accomplish the movement with minimal um, joint wear, if you will, um, and the most efficient way possible. So really what we're getting at is if we're constantly using that bouncing off at and skipping over that control aspect, we're creating that micro trauma, that inflammation, which over time will reduce our ability to move the joint.
Yes, and so we talked about before, if we took like a several weeks, several month range of motion assessment on a particular joint. We'll take the bench press. We measured your shoulder, uh, and we like, let's say we had dysfunctional connective tissue, and we were the type of person that would be bouncing out of the hole. Uh, we would actually see at the end of that, we'd see that shrunken workspace, and part of the reason why is by that constant bouncing, whether it's a bench press or a squat. By bouncing on the joint, we're creating this tiny little bit of trauma, and then when your body actually heals, it's actually going to shrink up even more. So not just accommodation, but you're creating this inflammation, you're creating this fibrosis, this disorganized tissue. Because when tissue heals, it doesn't lay down in a nice, pretty straight line the way you want it to. It just lays it down in any sort of direction.
Right.
So in doing so, we actually see less range of motion, and people like who've already struggled with range of motion. Also, we can then talk about maybe here in a second, people who are hyperflexible, but people who struggle with range of motion and they're constantly kind of not controlling and bouncing out. You're creating these small little micro traumas, and we'll actually see. I mean, even if they're squatting to full depth each time, and it's just a slow wear over time that we'll actually see, because when that tissue heals, it actually then gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and we'll see decreased range of motion, even though you're squatting to full depth or benching to full depth. But by that bouncing on the joint, we actually are doing some sort of damage and then end up just slowly just shrinking up our range of motion over time.
Yeah, so what feels like full range of motion actually becomes quote unquote less than full, right?
Yes.
Because you're going to feel like you're at the bottom, but the nervous system in the beginning will say nope. Then over time, the capsule actually will kind of come up to that as well. So to your brain, it feels like full range of motion, but it actually, if we took video like day 1 and we took video, say day 60, we probably could see some definitely changes in how much you're squatting or bench press, whatever. So I think that keeping that in consideration, even though it might feel, this gets back to our feel component, right? So even though that the movement feels like we're going through full range of motion, it probably isn't. And that even gets back to the other concept of what is full range of motion. So full range of motion for a squat, full range of motion for a bench press, the variables are still confined to the bench press. If we took the joint, we're not actually using all of the edges of the joint. So, someone that's a runner and, oh, I run 25 miles a week. Why do I have knee arthritis? It's like, well, you get the arthritis in the area that you don't use. This gets back to the point, if you don't use it, you lose it. So even though they're using their knee a lot, they're still not using the entire surface of the knee. Same thing with the shoulder, same thing with the hip. So where you're not putting work into the joint is eventually going to kind of narrow up, and it will degrade over time.
Yes, and the other thing I mentioned before is so whether you're a very inflexible person and just have poor range of motion, it's never a good idea to bounce the joint. But those people who are also then hyperflexible, you also have potential risk factors there too, just because your body's not able to actually sense that tension, whether it's in like a bench press or a squat, and you're really, or sense that stiffness, and you're really just kind of then just bouncing over in time over on the joint and joint, and yeah, that can't be good either.
But that's the only way that they can feel it,
Yes.
because they can only feel extremes. So what would be extreme for the average person isn't extreme to them. And so the only way that they get the sensation of we're at end range is whenever they're just smashing into the absolute last bit of range of motion. And so for their feedback loop to actually complete, that's the only way that they get the sensation is by really taking it to the extreme range.
Yeah, and they don't seem to at least run into the, at least from my experience, the like decrease of like kind of like, at least from the external viewpoint, you don't see a loss in range of motion usually.
Yeah, they have a loss of control typically.
Is there any other ways that you what sort of negative consequences would you that would manifest as a result of more in the hypermobile person?
Um, well, typically, again, it goes back like they're not going to have nearly as much force production just because since they can't sense the stiffness, they're going to be kind of at the extreme ends, which means that their ability to produce force is much less. Whereas the super stiff person, they live in the middle. So they live in the zone that they can produce a bunch of force. So I would say that the person that's a little bit on the hypermobile side might be a little bit, I'm not going to say weak by any means, but they're not going to be able to produce as much force, which
No, that totally makes sense. I mean, if you were to take your most hypermobile athletes as a whole, they would typically not be they're going to be your biggest of athletes or your strongest of athletes.
yeah. So as far as like an injury, um, again, control is going to be there. Like, it's funny because people that are flexible like to do flexibility things or mobility things. People that are stiff like to do like
Strength.
stiff things, strength things. So we almost need to like give each person the opposite, right? Um,
Yeah, so like
and
those hypermobile people really kind of need to work on the connective tissue side and like slowing things down and adding more stiffness.
correct.
And
But
then
they don't like to do it, so
well,
they
nobody likes to train their weaknesses, but
yeah, yeah. But definitely so. Whereas the stiff person, they need to be creating that length. So again, you could be doing the same workout, but doing two different focuses, and you could be benefiting the loose connective tissue person versus the stiff connective tissue person, just by varying the time, varying like the scheme of how you produce the rep.
yeah. Oh yeah, so yeah, kind of back to the workspace and kind of like a good example uh, that I see kind of all the time of why workspace is important is I kind of like to describe it when I describe it behind it. Imagine we had a particular range of motion or a joint or a tissue. We'll take bench press. Let's say we use the muscles that we use in the bench press. We'll say A, B, and C. It equals 30 pounds of force production. So if we can essentially increase the amount of workspace that you have, the joint space that you have, we can essentially bring in more range of motion, but which is also going to then therefore bring in more biology, more brain muscle connection. So more connection at those in ranges of those muscle fibers. So now we can bring more muscle fiber into the exercise of the bench press, and we can get more force production. But then also, if hypertrophy is our goal, we can then therefore essentially make that muscle bigger just by increasing our workspace.
Absolutely. So again, the brain muscle connection. So the neurology of the joint. If we have the ability to, so let's think of it this way. The brain does not see the movement. The brain, like for the shoulder, the brain sees the space that the shoulder can move within. So if you've got two athletes, one has less workspace, one has more workspace, what the brain sees in the example of more workspace is more tissue to draw into the movement. If the brain sees less workspace, you're only going to be able to contract the tissue that's available to the space that you have available. So even though you might have this relatively large muscle, you might only have access to particular, fibers or lines within the muscle. And so the goal would be, as we increase workspace, we increase the ability for the brain to target, to draw in more to that particular exercise.
Yeah, and because the ultimate goal is if we're plateauing, and if, let's say, before the last episode we talked about how, I mean, if you're new to the work, if you've never worked out before, you just look at a dumbbell, you're going to get results. But if you've been working out for a while, it's like we got to bring ourselves back to that beginner. And when you're a beginner, you've literally done nothing. Everything you train has been untrained. So when we plateau, it's like everything's been we've currently trained everything we have. So the only way to get back to that beginner phase where we saw that higher rate of growth or higher rate of progress is to go after this untrained stuff. So if we can add more workspace, that's just now opens up more untrained stuff to get results out of. And like a great example, kind of going back to the bench press, and I see this all the time, is there's this concept of hypertrophying the length. So if we're trying to add size to the chest, because everybody loves making the chest bigger, it looks nice, yeah. So anyways, this hypertrophying the length. So starting with your muscle shortest, and then really just trying to fail it to length, the full length of the muscle. We can actually, what we end up seeing is that on people's dominant arm, usually your dominant arm is always going to have less internal shoulder rotation. So we have less workspace. We're going to have essentially less brain muscle connection. So we're going to not have nearly as much force production or feel. A lot of times clients will complain about how when they're in the bench press, either whether it's completely across the body and the shoulders all the way adducted, or even at the bottom of the bench press, we'll maybe sometimes see those elbows move on the more front side of the barbell, closer to the hips, just because they have a lack of internal rotation. So they're going to have lack of feel, lack of force production. So just by increasing internal shoulder rotation, we can increase like that overall feel we bring to the lift, and therefore making that chest bigger.
Yeah, so getting back to the feel component, there's a couple of things that you touched on that I thought were pretty good. So how the exercise feels. So people that are right-handed, their right-sided internal rotation tends to be less. And it's like, why is it less than on the side that they do less on? But that goes back to how the body constrains the tissue. So because you do more with your right, the right is constrained to what you do the most of. And whenever we see a lack of internal rotation, that's typically that the health of the joint, it doesn't mean that there's an injury, it doesn't mean that there's pain, but it just means that that's the first thing that we see when the health of the joint starts to decline. So because you do less overall with your left arm, it's less trained. So if we go back to the beginner kind of philosophy, your left side is more like a beginner than your right side. So you have to do more specific things to open up that workspace.
Yes, and then also to say too, when it comes to internal rotation, we're hardly ever moving into an internal rotation. So we're using our dominant arm, that right arm, a lot more, but we're also not moving into rotation. So we're certainly just we're constrained. It's like almost like a double-edged sword. We're not using that space, so we're not going to keep it. But then we're just basically then just confining that joint space to the movements we actually do. And like I said, you hardly use internal rotation. And like I think a good example would be another one is like if you ever did like that yoga infinity pose where one arm goes behind your back and one hand goes behind your head, and you try to meet your hands in the middle. Usually, you always see when your dominant arm's going behind the back, it's a little bit more of a struggle than compared to your non-dominant arm. And then, yeah.
Yeah, so the goal would be, could you get your hands one hand apart? Most people probably couldn't. So that's kind of a fun fact. Go ahead.
Yeah. So trying to get more workspace, bring more untrained tissue into the game. How do we do that? How do we improve our workspace for the sake of our audience without going into too much details? How do we do that? And the way we do that is whereas when we were training kind of connective tissue before, it was kind of at our in range. So like bottom of the bench press and holding these a little bit lighter but longer, more time under tension isometric holds would then therefore kind of tell our body that, hey, we need more connective tissue. Now, if we're trying to train workspace, we want to kind of think slightly different. We want to think maybe also then going to the in range of that particular range of motion and then applying a very hard isometric force to then kind of break free like a new range of motion and just to kind of almost like chisel out a little bit more space. There's this concept of, we'll go back to the shoulder, and it's the concept called obligate translation. Basically, if I'm moving my arm behind me, my shoulder joint moves forward. If I'm moving my arm in front of me, my shoulder joint's moving back, and you can apply that to 360 degrees around.
Right. So I think what you're saying is, even though what looks like maybe a linear motion, actually there's a bit of rotation happening inside the joint.
Yes. So if we're trying to improve workspace, well, first of all, if we look at the anatomy of our joints, everything but the spine, we kind of see, if we were to remove away layer after layer of muscle, we'd see the deepest muscle tissue is going to be rotational tissue.
Correct.
So even though we may be doing some sort of linear motion like a bench press or a squat or a pull-up, if we move inwards, we're seeing even that deepest tissue, that rotational tissue, is still getting worked. So we can argue that the stuff that's closest to where the actual movement happens is going to be the most important. So training rotational tissue, we'll talk about that some other time, but it's still getting worked in the process. So going to those in ranges and then applying either what we call kind of a contraction at length but isometric, but you want to take it up to a very like almost like a max effort.
Correct.
Well, then, like I said, it kind of forces, if we're at the bottom of the bench press, it forces that head of the shoulder forward anteriorly into the front of the socket, and it kind of like chisels out just maybe just a little bit more space. We could also then think about that and then applying some more internal rotation, and now we kind of move more space interiorly or externally, internally or externally, and shape a little bit more space there. So by taking your joints to their in range and applying either in a linear fashion or probably more importantly a rotational fashion, applying a hard isometric where there's no movement contraction, we end up kind of like shaving out a little bit more space.
Yeah, so max effort training has a lot of neurological drive, if you will. And so if we are under 80%, we're probably not going to be harnessing enough neurological effort to open up that space. So the key is getting to that 90+% or safest maximal effort, really, because in the beginning it might feel like max effort, but it might not actually be. But as you train it a little bit, you can feel a little bit stronger contraction. So the key is getting to that threshold, because if we're not meeting that correct signal, we're not actually, even though it might be a lot of effort, it might not be the actual intensity to drive the change.
So it's like max effort deadlift training, but at the very end range. And it's people. It's kind of interesting. It's like people. I mean, myself included. It's doing a lot of mobility work is not the funnest. It's not the sexiest. I think we get caught up in seeing the more tangible, I guess, movement of weights. But like people think it's like, oh, I'm not actually really working anything out. But like, if you've ever tried a max effort workspace contraction, I mean, it is every bit as tiring as the 1 rep max deadlift. And you're actually, from a energy expenditure standpoint, you're still doing almost the exact same thing. It's just one, you're able to see all this weight move, so you think you're actually working more doing that than just focusing on like trying to improve workspace in the joint. But everything is just perceived. It's all a neurological perception. You're still working just as hard, expending just as much energy. It's just now you're funneling it into, instead of raising that weight up, you're now funneling into just expanding that joint.
Correct. Yeah. So I've had several people, they want a deadlift instead of doing what we're doing, because the deadlift, oh, it's the king of exercises. It's like, oh, why is it the king of exercise? Because you can put a lot of effort into it. It's hard, right?
I mean, yeah, our biggest muscles are like our posterior chain.
Correct. So I mean, this is a whole nother episode, but we can get into the hormonal profile of creating intensity. So your brain doesn't know the difference between a max effort deadlift or a max effort hip external rotation isometric load. You're still going to drive the same neurochemical like profile if you're reaching that same level of intensity that you were in the deadlift. So whenever we think of max effort training, people are like, oh, well, I've got a deadlift this week. Well, if you don't have a hip capsule, you're going to be better off putting your max effort into training the hip capsule than worrying about whether you deadlift this week.
Yeah, because you're just going to therefore then keep more brain muscle connection to that particular tissue, which is then going to give you more biology, more muscle tissue to train.
Yeah, because it's like, I think the goal tends to be the exercise, and it's like, well, what does this exercise give you?
Yeah.
And so I think that the more we can focus on what's the purpose of this exercise versus, oh, we've got this in the program, I think that we're going to end up getting better results. We're going to get over those plateaus and sticking points much easier.
Yeah. More about what this exercise is, yeah, what the goal is out of this exercise, and then also the way it feels too, and not completing
Yeah, because you just don't want to do the exercise because that's in the program. If our goal is hamstring in the deadlift, you shouldn't feel your low back.
Yeah.
But if we went over to the gym and we said, hey, how many people feel your low back while you're deadlifting? 50% are going to say probably yes. And it's like, okay, well, why are you not seeing progress? Well, maybe because you're not actually harnessing the tissue that needs to be leveraged.
A rep is not a rep, Josh.
That's correct. Yeah.
So improving workspace, kind of like whatever, if you want to go after patternized exercise, and yes, there's something to be said about adding different degrees of line of tension, but going to that in range of that exercise or the in range of that joint, and then applying a hard isometric force into that will expand your workspace.
Yeah, and I think the key, you mentioned patternize. So part of this expanding workspace is almost to de-patternize in a way.
Deconstruct.
We're
Yeah.
never going to completely. So if you're a baseball player, you're a golfer, very like unilateral, doing the same thing over and over. Like we're never going to completely eliminate the asymmetry, but if we can pull you back to the middle just a little bit, you're going to be much better off as far as like mitigating injuries or being able to be more adaptable when you go do something else. Because I think, you know, as soon as you hear the word squat, as soon as you hear any named exercise, you already have a preconceived idea of what the exercise is supposed to look like, which that confines the variables of what you're going to be utilizing. So if we're talking about expanding workspace, people are going to ask like, what's the name of the exercise? Well, there is no name of the exercise. It's what you need and where you need it. So unfortunately, this becomes very individualistic. Everyone's going to need a little bit of workspace in their own unique way. It's not a universal, go do this exercise and everyone's going to get the same benefit. That's where the feel comes in. Because if you feel a stretch in a particular area and I don't, but I feel it in a completely different area, we're both getting the benefit because we're feeling what we need to feel. Where, if we're locked into, well, this is exactly how you have to do it, but it's like, well, I don't feel anything, then am I going to get benefit? Probably not as much as you if you're able to feel that correct feeling.
Yeah. That's pretty good. So yeah, we talked about connective tissue and workspace, kind of going after these untrained areas, these new beginning areas, to really kind of break through those plateaus that we're kind of experiencing in our everyday training, and just keep overall joint and tissue health.
Yeah, I think kind of getting back to, we talked about in the very beginning, if you're not training the connective tissue, not creating joint workspace, you might not be getting all that you could out of your workout. So I think that going after those untrained areas are really the way to bring you back to that beginner kind of profile. And just as a quick example, so I know a couple of clients who basically stopped deadlifting for a period of time. They started basically training workspace for 6 to 8 weeks. They went back to deadlifting and they actually increased their PR and they didn't touch a barbell for 6 to 8 weeks. So they got stronger without actually training the lift. And I think that's the big takeaway, that while it might look boring, it might not be what you traditionally would expect to be like the workout. You can see these gains that most people don't appreciate from training in this completely different fashion.
And then also kind of so we got four different camps that kind of make up movement training, whatever you want to call it. The things that we currently train, like we've trained and we've reached a plateau in, is the muscle tissue, and then like our CNS, so those like hard, heavy, max effort lifts. But the other two things is going to be workspace, your joint space, and then the connective tissue. So if we're not training two areas, we're essentially overloading your nervous system and then also your connective tissue, and you're kind of reaching plateaus in both. So
So I want to clarify. So we're overtraining, not over, but muscle and nervous system are the ones that we're over focusing on. We're not focusing on the joints or connective tissue.
Correct.
Yeah.
And when we imagine like an ecology. So if we let any two of those slip, we're going to kind of have this imbalance, and then this is where we're going to kind of typically run into more injuries. So by making sure we're training all four of those areas, we can essentially kind of keep the results coming, and we're going to fight off injury. But then, like I said, that's just we can always kind of bring in more biology into the equation and train it and just kind of keep the results coming.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about accommodation specifically. We could make a whole episode on that, but as you do a lift, the goal is to get better at the lift and to create more force production in the lift, right? And typically what we see is as we increase efficiency, as we increase force output, we get to a point where force output starts to just like not progress at the same rate. And so we see this kind of leveling off. And so at that point, the typical way of avoiding accommodation or avoiding, further accommodation is just to change the exercise. So, we might be doing standard flat bench press. Then we might say, okay, well, for the next 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to do an incline dumbbell or a different variation. And while that changes the line of tension throughout the pec, getting back to our workspace conversation, you're still taking the same workspace to a new exercise. So if you're limited in particular lines of tension, even though you change the exercise, you haven't changed the shape of the joint. And again, we could spend a whole episode talking about like shapes of joints and how the shape of the joint dictates how you're going to be able to output force. And so if we don't have good connective tissue, we don't have good workspace, and then we take that to a new exercise, we just take the same joint to the new exercise, and we're training the same tissue even though it's a different exercise.
So yeah. So just kind of reiterate things. So training connective tissue, we want to train lower intensities, longer time under tension, at length, going to length. And then for increasing workspace, trying to bring more biology into the equation, to better force production or to more muscle to increase in size, we want to take that joint to length as well, but apply high intensity isometric loading, and obviously for much shorter duration.
Yeah, much shorter duration. And if we can create a rotational load, it would be better than, but that's maybe another time, another place.
Yes, and always can seek out an FRS practitioner. I think they're if you're struggling with results, they can always help more. But just remember, in order to get back to that that beginning phase where you haven't trained anything, we have to go after this untrained tissue. And the two biggest areas, if you're plateauing right now, are going to be connective tissue and workspace. Remember, we got to shock the system.